There are jobs that bring you close to death, but few that force you to work with it. Grave diggers don't just bury bodies. They walk the fine line between the world of the living and the dead. They hear the whispers in the wind that no one else notices. They see shadows that don't belong. And sometimes they witness things that should never be spoken of. Tonight, you'll hear 5 chilling confessions from those who have spent their lives among the graves. Stories of things moving beneath the soil. Voices echoing from empty coffins. And encounters with something that doesn't want to stay buried. But before we begin, a warning. If you ever find yourself walking alone past a cemetery at night, and you hear someone calling your name from the darkness, don't answer. Some voices should remain unheard. Jack had been digging graves for over 20 years. He was the kind of man who never flinched, never believed in ghost stories, and never let the cold silence of the cemetery get to him. To him, death was just a part of the job. Something as ordinary as the dirt beneath his fingernails or the scent of fresh soil in the air. But there was one night, just one, that changed everything. It was late, well past midnight. Jack had stayed behind to finish a burial that had been delayed due to heavy rain earlier in the day. The cemetery was silent, unnaturally so, as if the world had stopped just outside its iron gates. The only light came from his lantern, its flickering flame casting long, shifting shadows across the rows of headstones. Every so often, the wind would pick up, making the trees whisper, a sound that had never unsettled him before. But tonight, something about it felt different. He worked steadily, the rhythmic scrape of his shovel, the only thing keeping the silence at bay. But as he dug, a strange sensation crept over him. The earth felt wrong, too soft, almost loose, as if it had been disturbed before. He paused, adjusting his gloves, telling himself it was just the rain playing tricks on him. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It gnawed at him, crawling up his spine like cold fingers pressing into his skin. Then his shovel hit something. Not wood, not rock. Something else. Something that gave slightly under the weight of his tool. A terrible thought slithered into his mind. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached down, brushing away the damp soil with trembling fingers. The moment his hand met what lay beneath, he recoiled. The texture was wrong, too smooth, too lifeless. His pulse pounded in his ears as he forced himself to look. And then he saw it. A hand, pale, motionless, half buried in the earth, fingers splayed open as if reaching for the sky. Jack's breath hitched, his body locked in place, his mind screaming at him to move, to do something, but all he could do was stare. He had buried his body earlier that day. He had seen it with his own eyes. The casket had been sealed. There was no way, no possible way, that a hand should be here. And then the fingers twitched. It was the faintest movement, a slight, almost imperceptible shift. But it was enough. Jack stumbled back, his shovel slipping from his grip, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind, each one worse than the last. Had there been a mistake? Had he buried someone alive? Was someone desperately trying to claw their way out? His stomach twisted. His breath came in short, uneven gasps. He needed to get help. He needed to dig, now. But just as he reached for his shovel, the hand moved again. This time, it didn't reach upward. It curled, slow and deliberate, as if grasping at something unseen. And then it pointed at him. Jack didn't scream. He couldn't. The air had been ripped from his lungs, leaving only the raw, gnawing horror that froze him in place. His legs felt like lead, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. And then movement, a whispering shift in the darkness, just beyond the reach of his lantern's glow. He wasn't alone. That was enough. He turned and ran, his boots kicking up damp soil as he bolted through the cemetery, past rows of silent, watching headstones. He didn't stop until he was outside the iron gates, his hands gripping the freezing metal, his chest heaving. The next morning, when the other workers came to check, they found the grave perfectly intact, the soil untouched, no sign of a hand, no proof that anything had happened. But Jack knew. He never worked alone after that, and he never, ever, dug past midnight again. There were many things Thomas had learned in his years as a grave digger: how to work through exhaustion, how to ignore the biting cold, how to keep his mind from wandering in the silence of the cemetery. But the one thing he never got used to was the sound. The earth is never truly silent. It settles, it shifts, it breathes in its own way. But sometimes, just sometimes, it makes noises it shouldn't. It happened on a night like any other. Thomas was finishing up a burial for an unclaimed body. No family, no mourners, just a pine box lowered into the ground under the dim glow of his lantern. He worked methodically, each shovelful of dirt thudding against the casket below. He had done this 1,000 times. There was no reason to feel uneasy. And yet, as the last layer of dirt covered the coffin, he heard it, a whisper, muffled, low, coming from beneath the soil. Thomas froze, his pulse hammering in his ears. His first thought was that it was the wind, slipping through the cracks between the headstones. But then he heard it again, louder this time, more distinct, a voice. His throat tightened as he pressed his ear to the ground, the damp soil cold against his skin. The whispering continued, soft, hurried, urgent. It didn't sound like someone screaming for help. It didn't sound like someone alive. It sounded wrong. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate. The voice of something that had been buried for too long. Thomas scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. His mind raced. Had there been a mistake? Had they buried someone alive? But then the whispering stopped. Silence swallowed the cemetery, heavy and unnatural. The air itself felt thick, pressing against his skin like unseen hands. Then, before he could move, before he could even breathe, the whisper came again. Only this time it spoke his name, a guttural, rasping voice from beneath the dirt. Something knocked against the coffin lid from below. Once, twice, a slow, deliberate rhythm. Thomas didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He dropped his shovel and ran. He never told anyone what happened that night. The grave remained undisturbed, the name on the headstone slowly worn away by time. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled through the cemetery, he swore he could still hear it, his name whispered from beneath the ground. Harold had worked at St. Augustine Cemetery for nearly 3 decades. He had seen just about everything: grieving families, forgotten graves, strange shadows cast by the flickering lanterns. But there was one thing he could never explain: the man in the gray suit. Harold first saw him late one evening, standing by an old grave near the edge of the cemetery. The man was tall, thin, and wore a suit that looked decades out of place. Gray, slightly tattered, like something out of an old photograph. His posture was stiff, his hands resting at his sides, and he didn't move, didn't blink, didn't react to Harold's presence. At first, Harold thought he was just another mourner, visiting a lost loved one. It wasn't uncommon for people to come at odd hours, seeking solitude in their grief. But something about this man felt off. Harold cleared his throat. "Sir, we're closing soon." The man didn't respond. Harold sighed, stepping closer. "Sir, But the words caught in his throat, because now, standing just a few feet away, he could see the man's face. And it was wrong. The features were there, eyes, nose, mouth, but they looked blurred, like a faded photograph left out in the rain, as if his face had been erased. A deep, icy chill spread through Harold's chest. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to leave, to pretend he had never seen this man. But before he could move, the figure did something that made his blood run cold. He smiled. It wasn't natural. It wasn't human. It stretched too wide, pulling at the edges of his blurred features, as if something else, something unseen, was trying to wear his face. Harold stumbled back, nearly tripping over a headstone. He blinked, just for a second, and the man was gone. The cemetery was empty. The only sound was the rustling of the wind through the trees, whispering through the graves. Harold stood there, frozen, his heart hammering in his chest. He had no explanation, no way to rationalize what he had just seen. The next day, he returned to the spot where the man had stood. He checked the nearby graves, looking for anything unusual. That's when he saw it. The headstone in front of him was old, so old that the name had been worn away by time, but the engraving at the bottom was still visible. Died 1932, and beneath that, a chilling inscription. He never left. Harold quit his job 2 weeks later, but sometimes, late at night, when he'd pass by the old cemetery, he swore he could see a figure in a gray suit standing among the graves, waiting, smiling. Luis had been a grave digger for nearly 15 years, and in all that time, he had only ever had one rule: never return to a grave once it's been sealed. He never questioned why. It was just an unspoken understanding among the workers. Once the dirt was packed, once the job was done, you walked away. You didn't linger. You didn't look back. And you certainly didn't return. But one grave refused to stay closed. It started with small things. The first time, Luis came back the next morning to find the dirt slightly sunken, as if someone had stepped over it during the night. He didn't think much of it, ground settling maybe, or a passing animal. But the next day, the soil was disturbed again, this time more noticeable. The surface looked uneven, like something had shifted beneath it. Luis frowned, pressing his boot into the ground, feeling the soft give beneath his weight. He should have packed it down better, he thought. So he did. He grabbed his shovel and smoothed the dirt again, making sure it was firm, solid. He even placed a small stone marker at the head, just to be sure no one was tampering with it. Satisfied, he left. The following morning, the grave was open, not just disturbed, not just sunken. Open. The dirt had been pushed aside, as if something had crawled out. The wooden coffin lid was cracked, the splintered edges facing outward. Luis's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't possible. His mind scrambled for an explanation. Grave robbers? But why? There had been no valuables in the casket. The body belonged to an old man, a local nobody. There was no reason for anyone to dig him up, and yet here it was. He forced himself to look inside. The coffin was empty. The old man's body was gone. Luis's hands trembled as he stepped back, his mind screaming at him to run. But just as he turned, he heard something behind him, a dry, brittle sound, like bones scraping against wood. From inside the grave, he didn't look. He didn't want to look, but his body betrayed him. His head turned just enough to see the coffin lid shifting, moving. Something was climbing back in. Luis ran. He never reported what he saw, never spoke a word to anyone. The next morning, the grave was sealed again. The dirt was perfectly packed, undisturbed. No signs of anything unusual. But Luis quit that same week. And to this day, no one knows that the man in that grave was ever truly dead to begin with. Eddie had always been a skeptic. He didn't believe in ghosts, curses, or any of the superstitions whispered among the grave diggers. To him, the dead were just that, dead, silent, gone. But there was one night that made him question everything. It was a routine burial, just like any other. An elderly woman, buried in the family plot beside her late husband. No funeral, no mourners, just Eddie, his shovel, and the cold night air. He worked quickly, the rhythmic scrape of metal against dirt the only sound in the vast emptiness of the cemetery. Then, as he tossed the last shovelful of soil onto the grave, he heard it, a knock, muffled, hollow, coming from beneath the ground. Eddie froze, his breath caught in his throat. He told himself he was imagining things. The sound had to be coming from somewhere else, maybe an echo, maybe shifting earth. Then it came again, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. From inside the coffin, Eddie's fingers clenched around the handle of his shovel, his mind racing. He had heard of cases, rare but real, where people were buried alive by mistake. It had happened before. What if it was happening now? He dropped to his knees, pressing his ear to the fresh dirt, straining to hear. Silence. Then scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound of nails dragging against wood. A chill crawled up his spine. His hands shook as he grabbed his shovel. He had to get her out. Now. But just as he drove the blade into the soil, it stopped. The scratching, the knocking, everything. The night fell silent again, heavy and suffocating. Even the wind had died. And then, just as Eddie exhaled, something knocked. But not from below. From behind him. The blood drained from his face. He turned slowly, his breath shallow, his body stiff with terror. There, standing just beyond the grave, was the old woman, her frail body wrapped in the same funeral dress she had been buried in, her eyes wide, black, empty. She opened her mouth as if to speak, and then she knocked, 3 slow, deliberate taps against the lid of an unseen coffin. Eddie dropped his shovel and ran. By the time the sun rose, the grave was just as he had left it, sealed undisturbed. No sign of anything unusual. No sign of the woman. But Eddie never returned to the cemetery after that night. And to this day, he refuses to knock on wood.